pressing the live button now. I'd like to welcome you all to this Association of Former British Colonies event. Today we'll be looking at the legacies of British colonisation in 5 different countries. My name is James Boston. I am the founder of the Association of Former British Colonies. Our platform intends to examine the legacies of British colonisation through social dialogue and educational content, similar to the type of content and dialogue that we'll be having today. I'll be joined by 5 speakers representing Guyana, Barbados, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Trinidad and Tobago. And they'll be making their presentations which seek to analyse how British colonisation continues to affect their respective nations. This will be part of a series that the Association of Former British Colonies will be conducting. And the end goal of this series is to have a series of these panel discussions with individuals from or speaking on behalf of different countries and different regions, existing British overseas territories, to really learn more about the global experiences that different people and different communities have had regarding British colonisation. And today will be the first of it. I would like to invite our first speaker to come forward to make a speech. His name is Lenny Rampersad. He's a first-generation Guyanese American, and he'll be speaking on behalf of Caribbean Crossroads. I would like to invite Lenny to come forward to unmute your microphone and to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, James, and thanks everybody else for joining me today. I just wanted to say that the reason why I really got into this topic and why it interests me so much is because I was not born in Guyana, and I was born and raised here in America. And we haven't done a very good job of documenting our history and what it means to be Indo-Caribbean, what it means to be a Guyanese person, what our people have been through. My parents don't really talk about it much. My grandfather's brother is kind of like our family historian, and he got me interested in it more. He was born and raised in Guyana, and he's actually traveled to India to where his ancestors are from. He even went to the village where his matriarchal ancestors are from, and they talked about his ancestors like to him. He got to like know them firsthand from the people in the village that grew up with her. And that was cool, and that was very interesting. But when it comes to the impact of the British and what it meant to him and how it affected them, you know, they didn't really talk about it too much. And that was really the part where I felt disconnected. So when James invited me, I was more than happy to do some research and see exactly what was going on with Guyana in terms of the British Empire. So I just wanted to start out real quick and say that the main point, because I have an outline written out here, and I'm going to try to keep this down to 10 minutes as best as possible, James. But the main point that I'm trying to make is that I overall see British colonization as a negative, since indentureship and slavery. And I just wanted to make a side note that indentureship pretty much turned into slavery. I know they say how the Indians had indentured servitude in Guyana, but they were lied to, and it pretty much turned into slavery as well. But on paper, I'll just say that since indentureship and slavery has left the people in Guyana in a state of poverty, and they deprived the people of Guyana of money, land, and exploited their resources. And also the British threw into turmoil racial tension between the demographics in Guyana, and it was created by the British initially when the Indians and Africans arrived, which in turn delayed the independence of Guyana in the 60s. So real quick, a brief overview of how the British kind of took over and came to Guyana. So it started way longer than I thought. And it started in 1746 when initially the Dutch were there and they were in control. And the authorities opened up Demerara to British immigrants. So from 1746 to 1760, the British kept coming in more and more. This influx, eventually by 1760, the British made up the majority of European immigrants in Demerara. So by 1781, the planters in Demerara and Essequibo had a pressured relationship with the Dutch. And this increased the cost of government, which caused a war to break out between the Dutch and the British. The British won and occupied Berbice, Essequibo, and Demerara. So you can see this is the start of the British gaining power in Guyana. So that happened in 1781. Move forward to 1786, the British growth continued, and internal affairs of this once Dutch colony became under British control. So in 1795, after that, this was when the French Revolution happened, and this was a catalyst for the British to take over Dutch colonies all across the Caribbean around this time. Move forward again to 1796. So that was 1795, and now in 1796, Berbice and Demerara and Essequibo became united, and they were named the United Colony of Demerara and Essequibo. So Berbice and the United Colony of Demerara and Essequibo were fully under British control by then. And move forward to 1834 or 1831, the London Convention of 1814 was when they officially named it British Guyana. And then from 1831 to 1966, the British control was in full power and it never stopped. But in 1966, that was when the British ended their rule finally. Guyana claimed independence, and that's how the name Guyana with a Y, it went from British Guyana to Guyana, came to be. So that was just a brief introduction and outline of how the British started from the early 1700s. And it kind of didn't stop between the Dutch and the British in the beginning of the 1700s, but then the British became in full control by the late 1700s. And then from the early 1800s to 1966, British had control over Guyana and their resources, and they had political influence. I don't know any other country that had such a long ruling because I haven't done research on the other countries. I'm so excited to hear from the other people. But some of the examples of why I think this was a negative, for instance, the reason why Indians and Africans were brought there was because we were the agricultural masters. You know, we knew how to grow rice and sugarcane anywhere you put us, you know, and that was valuable at that time. So like sugarcane, diamond, gold, bauxite, these cultivation profits never went back to the people under the British rule. You know, this is oppression. This is how the people were left in a state of poverty after they left, and they're meant to pick up the scraps that the British left behind. And also this diverse racial narrative between the Indo and Afro communities that the British pit us against each other. And you can kind of see it in the political parties in Guyana, that they're pretty much split between Black and brown people there. And that kind of goes back all the way back to the history of how the British kind of controlled our demographic in a negative manner. So there's many more examples, but those are the two that really stuck out to me: resource exploitation and racial inequality. In a modern context, you can kind of still see that there are issues. There's still racial tensions there, like I said, with the political parties, but there are stories about racial injustice, not with like the government, but between the two different people. And it's bound to happen in a place that's so diverse. It used to be called the land of six people. So I'm not really surprised, but I feel like because the British had that narrative long time ago, it still kind of just made its way to like the modern context. So in summary, like, I'm grateful and proud to be Guyanese at the end of the day. I'm a Guyanese American, and it's unfortunate what the British did, in my opinion, but I wouldn't be an Indo-Caribbean or Indo-Guyanese if that didn't happen either. I think what they did in turn kind of created our own culture that's very beautiful. It's influenced by Africa, India, China, and more. And it just kind of all came together to who we are today. The problem is the oppression of the British has also caused intergenerational and ancestral trauma. And this has affected like the mental health of many Indo-Caribbean people. And you can kind of see those issues still today. Brown Gal Diary, they did a great study on intergenerational trauma that you guys really need to check out. And they do mention the history of our people, and the British did have a part to play in that. The British and Dutch subjected our people to poor working and living conditions. And, you know, these caused traumas from us being displaced from our homeland. Trauma such as gender-based violence, mental health issues, racism, substance abuse, identity crisis. Identity crisis is something I faced. It was part of the reason why I wanted to create Caribbean Crossroads and work with you, James, as well. And also unhealthy relationships. You know, these are all issues that you still see today amongst Guyana and Guyanese people that are not in Guyana as well still today. So this is kind of my take on it. And I know I'm not from Guyana directly, born and raised, but this is really essentially what it means to me.
Thank you very much, Lenny. I really enjoyed listening to that. And we'll be exploring more questions later on. I'd like to invite all of our guests and audience to use the chat bar to ask questions, and we will pick up all of your questions later at the Q&A session. So don't feel like your comments aren't being heard or that we're not paying attention to them. Thank you, Lenny. Really interesting to hear your take and your overall feeling that the British colonization has had a negative effect on Guyana. We'll be exploring that with some questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm now going to read the biography of our next speaker. And his name is Rodney Chaka, and he'll be speaking about South Africa. Rodney S. Chaka was born in a small township on the extreme outskirts of Kimberley called Ritchie. He has a BTH, an MDiv, and a licentiate, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, in theology, an MTH, and a PhD. He's an alumna of Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, I think it's GA, is that Georgia? I'll have to check that with you later. He was taught theology and ethics at Murray Theological College in Zimbabwe. He was an associate professor of ethics and community at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey, USA. He was chair of the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology, and is currently full professor of Systematic Theology and Theological Ethics and director of the School of Humanities in the College of Human Sciences and the University of South Africa. He's also an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa. Furthermore, he is one of the founding conveners of the Transatlantic Round Table on Religion and Race, as well as an editorial board member of Black Theology. These are just some of his many accolades. And at this moment, I'd like to invite Rodney to unmute your microphone and to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother James. I think I should have shortened that considerably because it took about 2 minutes of the 10 minutes that I have. But let me just say, you know, the subject that you have asked us to have a conversation around is quite broad. And so I was struggling to look at particular angles, maybe to respond to it. But I have put down a few ideas that I would like to share with you in the hope that it can spark some conversation. British colonization or Western colonization, as I would like to put it, has clearly had a great impact on South African life. It is known that the British colony of South Africa came about in 1806, later with the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The colony became the province of the Cape of Good Hope. The British wanted to control South Africa because it was one of the trade routes to India. However, when gold and diamonds were discovered between the 1860s and 1880s, the interest in the region increased. It was around that same time that tensions started to flare up between the British and the Boers. So many factors contributed to the tension, but it should be noted that the question of the indigenous people was never expressed significantly, and this simply because the native, for all kinds of reasons, didn't matter. We have furthermore also seen how white supremacy could be used as a rallying point against Black self-determination. I suppose this for me is enough reason to speak not so much of British colonization, but of Western colonization of South Africa. Now, the closing years of the 19th century witnessed the consummation of European imperial ambitions in the complete dismemberment and colonization. Colonial conquest and imposition of violent European rule on the partially destroyed and suppressed indigenous societies, and the inserting of Africa into the modern European capitalist world as a dependent appendage to it, effected decisive breaks and distortions in the previous patterns of life prevalent on the continent at large. The likes of Basil Davison argued that, for instance, the colonial period in European mythology was supposed to have effected that particular transition from pre-colonial to modern society, but it generally failed in doing that. Thus, historically, the colonial period was a hiatus, an interlude, when African history was stopped or was forced to become, for that period, a part of European history. African historical existence was suppressed, and Africa was forced to become the negative underbelly for European history. The Eritrean philosopher Sero Kubirhan avers that what is paradoxical about all of this is the fact that Europe undertook the domination of Africa and the world not in the explicit and cynical recognition of its imperial interest, but in a delusion that it was spreading civilization. It thus refers to Rudyard Kipling's poem titled A White Man's Burden. A few words from this poem are essential in helping us understand this perverted psychology of conquering Africa in the world. The first stanza reads, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, on the flattered folk and wild, your new court, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So for him, this stanza, the white man's burden depicts concisely the European conception of itself and of the non-European. This conception unhesitatingly sees itself as the proper embodiment of human existence as such, and goes on to impose itself on the non-European who is viewed as half devil and half child. And it's important that we note that this conception by Kipling is not an isolated image, but rather an accurate articulation of European colonial consciousness, which was amply represented in the popular literature of the day, but also in the enduring conceptions and speculations of modern European thought. So in the name of universality of values, European colonialism violently universalized its own singular particularity and annihilated the historicality of the colonized. In this context, Western philosophy or theology, in the guise of disinterested universalistic and transcendental speculative discourse, served the indispensable function of being the ultimate veracious buttress of European conquest. All of these ideas of civility and in the interest of man sounded well, because for James, the question of enlightenment in modern European thought was a political orientation towards a struggle of the superstition that at the time was prevalent on the continent. And this is seen as distinct from the established Christian doctrine. Antonin Grafsky, for instance, has looked at this orientation of European thought as nothing but the presupposition of a single culture, a singular religion, a singular global conformism, that is a singular globalized cultural totality. Edward Said, for instance, speak of all of this as the result of colonialism in a colonized world. Therefore, a widely varied group of little Europes throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas became the norm. The little Europes constituted on the African continent required the replication of European institutions and forms of life and the simultaneous depreciation and suppression as barbaric, savage, and non-human of African institutions and culture. They also required the systematic inculturation of urbanized Africans, whose very formation as a section of the dominated society was predicated on the rupture of African historical existence in the face of European violence. Thus, the Europeanized sections of colonized Africa were physically and culturally disinherited. The non-Europeanized sections, on the other hand, were forced to submit to a petrification of their indigenous cultural historical existence. This is not at all to suggest that urbanized and at various levels Europeanized Africans consciously and in this very same terms endorses the European metaphysical prejudice just mentioned, nor is it to argue that indigenous cultures were completely obliterated by colonial conquest. Instead, it is to indicate and strongly emphasize the fact that Europeanized Africans internalized negative disposition towards its own indigenousness, and its estrangement from African cultures and traditions has deep roots and finds its ultimate veracious justification in the dissolutionary metaphysical belief articulated in and out of the traditions of the West. On the other hand, the cultural historical stagnation of indigenous non-Europeanized African is itself the result of Western conquest, which is ironically used to justify this same conquest. So the colonial project of conquest has brought with it a number of challenges for the African. Most importantly, what this colonial project was able to do was to precipitate what I would like to call a flight from the black self. Francis Nyamjo was thinking of this when he argued, just as African presidents prefer to beg and bank in foreign currencies, ignoring even banknotes that bear their own faces and stamp of omnipotence, so is their preference for their foreign intellectual expert over homegrown expertise, close quote. A question that is very important for me is the question of education. And as we speak, and the discourse today that we have is the struggle over the curricula in South Africa. And education for Africans has, in the main, tended to be an exercise of self-evacuation and evaluation of all that took pre-colonial generations' wisdom, cultural creativity, and sweat to realize. The fact that Africans have placed and continue to place a very high premium on getting educated in the West or in local variants and franchises of European and North American institutions has only compounded the problem. Locating the challenge more precisely at home, Nyamjo argues that in South Africa, for example, despite numerous local universities and relatively long history of university education, a doctorate from Britain or the USA is still valued higher than anything obtained locally. Like other Africans, South Africans instinctively ask one another and others, where did you do your degree? Depending on the university you name, you could be treated as a superior, an equal, or an inferior by a fellow academic. Some Africans would rather graduate from Oxford, Harvard, or the Sorbonne, even if this means changing their specializations to accommodate the limited academic menu offered in these heavyweight Western universities. Africans continue to flood Europe and North America to research aspects of their own countries, mostly for the prestige and status that studying abroad brings, only to end up as disillusioned and incomplete Africans. Parents continue to send their children to Europe, North America, and elsewhere for education with the conviction that a degree, even from a commercialized and second-rate Western university, is worth a lot more opportunities than one from a purportedly top university in Africa. Unless such universities are those generally perceived to be Western universities in Africa, such as some in South Africa, and I can name a few: Stellenbosch University, University of Cape Town, Wits University Pretoria, etc. Again, I refer to Nyamjo, who raises significant questions which must not be ignored by anyone who takes the subject of challenging the current African curricula. He asks, could this extraversion and xenophilia in matters educational explain the inability to radically transform curriculum even when their irrelevance is widely recognized. Could this also explain the often ludicrous obsession with maintaining without problematizing inherited standards? Now, having dealt with the question of education, it would be remiss of me not to point to some of the challenges which I consider to be after effects of colonialism. That is rampant among Black South Africans and our African brothers north of the Limpopo River. South Africa has made news recently for quite the wrong reasons by showing intolerance to African brothers and sisters. While this intolerance is more palpable at the level of where the majority is located and where the majority, still languish in poverty, it would be incorrect to assume that the same is not prevalent in the Black middle class. The contention among the masses is that Blacks from other parts of the continent continue to steal jobs and their women. It is funny, though, to discover that that while you have almost a great number of whites coming from other parts of Europe where they have struggling economies, these are not seen as people coming to steal the jobs, but instead the perception is that if you're Black and not South African, you are most likely here to come and steal the already scant jobs, while you're white, you are here to most likely contribute to the economy. And so these are all as a result of a liberation project that has not yielded the necessary fruits that many South Africans are experiencing. And as such, it becomes quite easy to look at the Black adder as a person, as an outlet to deal with that kind of frustration. And so these are for me the very issues that are key and that are central in the discourse that we have in South Africa today. I mean, for instance, there is quite different schools of thought on this matter. You have, for instance, the Put South Africa First, who insists that all Africans mostly who are not of South Africa are supposed to be repatriated so that we are then able to deal with South African issues. And then, of course, you have a school of thought that speaks of a united Africa and is quite critical of the borders that we created as a result of Western greed, hell-bent on exploiting, all that Africa had. And so I think, given the 10 minutes that I was given, I'm just going to pause here and take it back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Rothney. That was really insightful. A real overview and insight into the sort of many different fragments that kind of have resulted as legacies of British colonization. And we'll definitely be exploring those more in the Q&A session. I've got quite a few questions that I want to ask you later on in the event. I'm now going to read the biographies of two individuals who'll be making a joint presentation about Barbados. The first of which is Andrew Millington, who is an independent filmmaker and an educator. He is a senior lecturer in motion picture arts and head of the Department of Creative and Performing Arts in the new Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts at the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. He is also a director, producer, and editor. In addition to Andrew, he'll be joined by Marcia Burrows, PhD, who serves as the current Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts at the University of West Indies Cave Hill campus. Marcia and Andrew, I would like to invite you forward. Andrew, I believe that you are sharing the PowerPoint, so I'll spotlight you and we can get started. Just make sure that you both unmute your microphones.
Thank you for the introduction, James.
Here we go. Thank you. It's saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, it should screen.
It's not allowing me to share.
It's not allowing you to share. One moment.
Colleagues, while we get our PowerPoint up.
There we go. Thank you.
We have it. Our presentation is based around the now well-known speech by our first Prime Minister of an independent Barbados, Mr. Errol Walton Barrow. And he coined the phrase, "No loitering on colonial premises after closing time." Thank you, Andrew. You can go to the next slide. So he traveled to England in 1966 several times, but at the Constitutional Conference in England, where it was to be decided whether Barbados would become independent, or he placed his argument for independence, these are some of his statements. He reminded them that Barbados wasn't conquered or purchased, but actually was settled, and settled not by the Britain, but by England, because it was in 1625. Britain, the United Kingdom, comes about later in the 18th century. He reminded them that 90% of our people are of African descent, and that Barbados is ripe and ready for independence. He's saying this to them in 1966. Next slide, please. Thank you, Andrew. And he reminded them that colonialism really safeguards the interests of the mother country and empire. He also says, for example, even now, we in Barbados have sent up thousands of people to work for you in the post-World War II movement. We've sent doctors, lawyers, nurses, bus drivers. Thousands of our best citizens are now in your space. We are mature. And he ended his statement by saying, my government, I assure you, sir, will not be found loitering on colonial premises after closing time. To say that, he said he had a meeting with Canada on the 5th of July, and therefore would need to have some clear direction. Barbados became independent on the 30th of November, 1966. Now, I was asked to provide a timeline, and I am beginning with an interventionist thought of, I will not take the timeline dictated by empire. I will take the timeline coming with geology and indigeneity. So the island is 60,000 plus years old. By the time the English arrive, there have been Tainos, Kalinagos, indigenous peoples there. And we now know of at least one name that the island as an island was called, Ichiroganim, and I thank the Garifuna person of Belize who helped me with the pronunciation. However, when the Portuguese sailed through, as it is claimed, or the Spanish, we're not quite sure yet, they named the island Los Barbados. And in the traditional story of European imperialism, an English ship was blown off course on the way to Brazil. That could all be made up, but that's what the story says. So they were blown off course on the way to Brazil, and they came upon this island. Kamal Brathwaite, the poet, begs us, go back in time, close our eyes, clear leaf of dreamer, drift plantations away, the plantations that the Europeans made, that the English made. I remember ancient water courses, dead streams, carved footsteps. So he's calling us to think of an island with carved footsteps, carved by human hands. However, one of the legacies of imperialism and colonialism is that there is an official narrative of Barbados. For example, in 1955, a lady named Ironmonger wrote, the island was a clean slate, English from the beginning and English right through. And that has continued. So we know there's no tabula rasa, but when you read some of the representations of the island of Barbados, its history only begins when England shows up, 1625. And unfortunately, to echo some of the concerns of my previous speaker, in our education system, we do stress the 1625. Just to let you know, when the English came, they found two bridges, two man-made bridges. There was one in a space by what we call the Corinage, and they named the capital after that space, and they called it Bridgetown. However, again, in teaching, we do not stress the Bridgetown because the bridge was there when the English came. There was another bridge off Whole Town. So we have been struggling with living in the shadow of Englishness in Barbados. We have been called a quintessential New World slave society because we really were the ultimate and the first blueprint of that. Also, we were so valuable, unfortunately, in the 17th century, the we being the country because of the enslaved Africans working on the sugar plantations, that the Dutch tried to buy Barbados from the British and were told no. In other words, they then sent them, they wanted to exchange Barbados for New York. Can you imagine that in the 17th century? Because at that time, Barbados was known as a jewel in the crown 200 years before that name was applied then to India. So Gandhi, the Kenyan philosopher, reminds us that the narrative of Englishness is one that we all colonized peoples are forced to consume with a pseudo-historicism that really falls apart when you stare at it. For example, when do you begin the history of this island? If you begin it in 1625, you ignore thousands of years of history. Also, what happens, because again, my colleague said it before, with the English arrival and with European arrival, that becomes the arrival of civilization and culture. So cultural practices of the African enslaved and their descendants are considered not culture, because through European eyes, such as Conrad and Kipling, we have lost our culture. I argue against that. I'm going with Stuart Hall, who says culture is to be understood as maps of meanings. So if Andrew goes forward to the next slide, here we are. In the post-colonial moment, we continue to battle with these narratives of Englishness. I'm showing you the picture, probably in the late 19th century, early 20th century, of a place called Jubilee Gardens and St. Mary's Church. Our challenge in post-colonial societies is to find a way of visualizing the past that serves to interrupt given narratives and create a sense of an altered historical consciousness. But it is a battle, because just as we're trying to visualize and create those memorials, voices of elite or those who want to keep the way as it was are battling against that. So one of the questions we have that we're looking at, how do we visibly pierce the relative silence about slavery in Barbados? Barbados is the quintessential slave colony. Even now, we are still wrestling with it. The image you see in front of you was popularly known, that space was known as the Shambles. It was a slave market. Enslaved people sold their goods there, but during slavery, it is highly possible it might have been a market that sold people. Next slide, please. We are not sure. It's one of those silences. This is what it looks like today. So this is the Shambles, but it's not called the Shambles. What we have are these silences around matters of slavery. So in 1887, the Queen Victoria celebrated her Jubilee, and Barbados, the government of Barbados, the colonial government, renamed the space of the Shambles Jubilee Gardens, which is still known as today. I'm just giving you a heads up that in 1888, that was the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Declaration. And the Barbados government officially did not celebrate it. The people did, the government did not. So we have these battles of narratives. What is of greater value? Queen Victoria's celebration of her Jubilee was deemed of greater value. The official Jubilee of Emancipation was deemed as not. And so in 2014, this is what we're struggling with. We further covered it up. So the Shambles are further covered. It looks very dainty. You walk through it. It's a historic park. Activities happen there, but we don't speak about the Shambles. We've silenced it. And this is one of the arguments for, in a post-colonial state, how to recover these silences, or as Sutton argues, how then do post-independence Anglophone Caribbean states deal with this historical legacy? I pass on to my colleague.
So one way of looking at the state of identity, and certainly we are acknowledging that empire has actually initiated a state of crisis with respect to identity. And I want to bring you to some images that are part of the Bridgetown allure, so to speak. Recognizing, of course, that the global media found it very interesting that Barbados would become a republic and, quote unquote, ditch the Queen as their constitutional head of society. In Barbados, there's a bronze statue of, or there was, but we'll learn more about that in a minute. The British Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, set up in 1813. It was to commemorate Nelson and the British Royal Navy's victory over the French and the Spanish, the Battle of Trafalgar. This space in Barbados then becomes Trafalgar Square. And it's, Marcy has been talking about the careenage. It's right at the edge of the careenage. And interestingly enough, we talked about the Jubilee Gardens, sort of hiding the idea that there was a slave market there. This was one of the first places where the enslaved were actually bought and sold. trying to bring us forward now into contemporary time, the image of Lord Nelson sits quite interestingly before you enter the Parliament buildings. Now, in the 1990s, and this is the first sort of arguments that begin to emerge, a number of persons actually began to say we should take down Nelson. And in fact, it fell on deaf ears. In fact, there was complete revulsion about that particular idea. And the people took it upon themselves to deface Nelson. And you see the paint that was actually thrown on the statue. Interestingly enough, 2019, with the Black Lives Matter protests, which of course you would have recognized were to protest the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police in the US. In Bridgetown, that too became a point of, well, they used it as a point to begin to look at some of the injustices that were taking place on the island. But interestingly enough, in the protest march, they would stop at Lord Nelson and actually make a prayer that, as we began to recognize, was a call for the removal of the statue. And this is just a very quick, I'm not going to show all of you. So I was talking about people and their response, and this is the social media response. This is the video that went viral. The young people actually making the linkage between the removal of Nelson and what was happening across the globe. And interestingly enough, what makes it even fascinating is that image ends, or that meme ends with the video. Meme ends with the flag of Barbados. This pushes, even before the question of republic, the Barbados government decides, okay, we're going to go with this, and we're going to dismantle, we're going to take down Nelson, all right? Of course, you see here that was actually no plan to replace him with anything. It was empty. And the people again respond. There's a folk icon, I call him, Ninja Man he's known as, and he's famous for dressing up in costumes and making very insightful comments about what's going on in the society. Here, he actually jumps up on the vacant platform and goes through a number of poses as to speak to the authorities to say, maybe this is the kind of image that we want to replace Nelson with, the statue. Of course, there is an emancipation statue. It is, interestingly enough, called the Emancipation Statue, but the people of Barbados refer to it as the Bussa statue. And Bussa, of course, is the leader of an 1816 rebellion of enslaved persons. And that was really the push for emancipation in 1838. And note that this particular statue stands at least 15, 20 miles away from the site of a hero square. So Trafalgar Square, actually where Nelson stood, was transformed, even while Nelson was standing there and there was no idea they were going to move him, into Hero Square, which essentially would make Nelson a hero. But Bussa is left out. I want to move just finally to this idea of empire and how it figures significantly in the idea of whether this crisis of identity that empire has brought us is something that we're working through or something that is constraining us. And so what you see here is the Empire Theater. And the Empire Theater was famous for not only live shows, but it also was the main source of all of your Hollywood fare. And it was owned by the British Colonial Film Exchange. And you could go through the entire empire, and you will find that these cultural institutions were actually set up to ensure that this cultural penetration would take place. However, by the 80s, as you can see here, the empire fell out of favor, went into financial decline. And in so doing, the government, which really had responsibility for what would happen with the empire, could find no real purpose for it. It was supposed to have been repurposed as a cultural theater in and of itself. The latest iteration, I won't go through all of them, is that it should become a beer garden, believe it or not. So across from the theater, Freedom Park, which commemorates the 1937 riots, which initiates the enfranchisement of the African section of the population, is set up. And still, this image of the empty theater just looms large for me, certainly. And shooting this image around sunset, to me, really said, it sort of prefigures what Derek Walcott says about the twilight, this place where we seem to be trapped in not being able to act. And I'll leave it there. Who says the sun never sets on the British Empire? In fact, if you go through and do the research, everybody has something to say about this initial idea of the sun never sets on the British Empire. And I'll leave you with John Ruskin. The Empire of England, on which for me the sun never set, has become one on which he never rises.
Thank you very much, Marcia and Andrew, for that presentation. Just bear with me one moment.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. Really interesting presentation. And again, we'll be looking forward to discussing that towards the end during our Q&A session. I have a number of questions, particularly around Barbados's recent move to become a republic and how that could influence things going forward. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, who will be speaking about the Sri Lankan experience and legacies of British colonization. His name is Prasanna Sonmugatas. He's a graduate of the Master of Global Affairs program at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Prasanna has worked in multiple organizations advocating for peace and disarmament. Since 2013, Prasanna has been the director of a human rights-based social media group, Stop Human Rights Violations in Sri Lanka, which works to spread information about the past and ongoing human rights abuses of both state and non-state actors in the war-torn nation. Prasanna, I'd like you to unmute your microphone and you can begin your presentation when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you. So to provide some background, Sri Lanka, known as Ceylon during the period of colonial rule, is an island nation in South Asia. Sri Lanka's population is ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse. The majority of Sri Lanka's population consists of the ethnic Sinhalese people who presently constitute about 74% of the population, and they speak a language called Sinhala. And a majority of the Sinhalese people belong to the Buddhist religion. Sinhalese people predominantly reside in the south and west of the country. The second largest population group in Sri Lanka is the Tamil people. There are two groups of Tamil people living in Sri Lanka. First, there's a group known as the Sri Lankan Tamils, who constitute 11% of the population. The Sri Lankan Tamils are an ethnic group who speak the language Tamil, and a majority of them reside in the northern and eastern part of the country. The majority of Tamils are of the Hindu religion. The second group of Tamils are known as the Indian Plantation Tamils, who constitute 4% of the population. The Indian Plantation Tamils are not indigenous to Sri Lanka, but instead they descend from South India and were brought over to Sri Lanka by the British in the 19th century to work on the tea plantations in the central highlands of the country. In Sri Lanka, unlike the Portuguese and Dutch, who were respectively the first and second Western colonial occupiers, the British succeeded in conquering the entire island, and the British had colonially occupied Ceylon longer than any other power from 1796 to 1948. I would argue that British colonization had a negative effect on Sri Lanka. Not only that, but I would also argue that British colonization of Sri Lanka laid the foundations for long-lasting ethno-national contentions and the 30 Years' Civil War, which occurred a few decades after Sri Lanka gained its independence in 1948 with dominion status in the Commonwealth. One way in which the British were responsible for sowing ethnic divisions was a result of their colonization of language. The Colebrook-Cameron Commission from 1829 to 1832 was a committee sent by the British government to examine its colonial government in Ceylon. The commission, with its initial goals towards undertaking economic reforms throughout Ceylon, also instituted plans of language reform, which proved to have a detrimental effect in post-independent Ceylon. The commission recommended that English become the medium of instruction at secondary and tertiary levels. The British viewed the English language as superior over the indigenous languages of Tamil and Sinhala. To ensure the value of the English language remained high, the British felt it was best to restrict the education of the language to a small segment of the society, despite widespread interest among the general population to learn the language. As asserted by distinguished Sri Lankan historian K.M. De Silva within his book, A History of Sri Lanka, the British-led government's desire to pursue education in English was for the pure interest of training a small segment of native Sri Lankans to work within the lower sectors of the colonial administration. According to the English professor and Sri Lankan Trotskyite politician Doric D'Souza, on the eve of Dominion status in 1948, only 6% of the population was reported in the census as literate in English. The introduction of English by the British created economic and social disparity within the island that exists to this day. English was regarded then and now as a requirement in order to achieve social and economic mobility. English, as described by K.M. De Silva, was the hallmark of elite status. Owing in part to the education system implemented by the American Christian missionaries of the 1800s, who were largely based in the Tamil-dominated north of the country, the minority Sri Lankan Tamils had more access to English language than the majority Sinhalese population, and thus disproportionately gained more privileged positions within the colonial administration. Consequently, preferential treatment which the British had given to the minority Tamils created a sense of bitter social and economic resentment among the Sinhalese. So, upon independence, in order to overthrow British dominance, Sinhalese nationalists felt the need to do away with English as the national language. In 1956, the Prime Minister of Ceylon, SWRD Bandaranaike, who was elected into office after campaigning on a Sinhala nationalist agenda, implemented the Official Language Act, commonly known as the Sinhala Only Act, which sought to make Sinhala the only official language in post-independent Ceylon. The act was a direct repudiation of the British colonization, of the British colonial imposition of the English language. Within the act, however, the Sinhalese refused to recognize Tamil as an official language, despite the fact that Tamil speakers in Sri Lanka were the second largest population group on the island after the Sinhalese. The Sinhalese learned from their former colonial master, the British, how language can be used as a tool of oppression. Making Sinhala the only official language of the country immediately dispossessed Tamil speakers from government positions, administrative services, legal services, and other privileged positions within society, as many Tamils did not understand or speak the Sinhala language, which became required to work in those positions. As noted by Michael Brown and Sumit Ganguly in their book, Fighting Words, Language Policy and Ethnic Relations in Asia, I quote, in 1956, 30% of the Ceylon Administration Service 50% of the clerical service, 60% of engineers and doctors, and 40% of the armed forces were Tamil. By 1970, those numbers had plummeted to 5% of Tamils in Ceylon's administration service, 5% in clerical service, 10% of Tamil engineers and doctors, and only 1% of Tamils were in the Sri Lankan military. It is thus worth understanding, in addition to repudiating the British, the Sinhala Only Act was designed to subjugate the minority Tamils as retaliation in the eyes of Sinhalese nationalists for holding disproportionately favorable positions within British Ceylon. Shortly after the Sinhala Only Act was passed in 1956, there was an ethnic pogrom in 1958 against the minority Tamil community at the hands of Sinhala Buddhist nationalists, killing anywhere from an estimated 150 to 1,000 Tamils. This was the first of many ethnic pogroms against the minority Tamils that would occur in independent Ceylon, the root causes of which can be traced back to the British. After the Colebrook-Cameron reforms of 1833, the British transferred political power to Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, in two main stages, in 1931 through the Donoughmore Commission and in 1948 through the Soulbury Commission. These two stages of Western constitutional reform were central to setting up the framework for ethno-nationally motivated discrimination against minority communities by successive Sinhala Buddhist-dominated governments. In 1931, the Donoughmore reforms abolished the system of communal representation, whereby a certain number of seats were assigned to English-speaking elite Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, and other communities. The abolition of communal representation strengthened the hands of the political class of the majority Sinhalese community. The Donoughmore Commission extended the franchise and allowed elections based on universal suffrage. However, upon abolishing communal representation, the Donoughmore Commission turned out to be a failure with respect to the fact that it did not suggest any alternatives, such as a workable form of federalism to contain communalism and ensure adequate political representation of the minority communities. Minority leaders, such as Sir Ponnambalam Ramanathan on behalf of Tamils and T.B. Jaya on behalf of Muslims, made pleas to the British that the Donoughmore Commission is unacceptable to the interests of their respective communities, as the Donoughmore reforms effectively removed the weightage for the minorities to compensate for the numerical superiority of the Sinhalese and left the nation devoid of any adequate checks and balances to prevent discriminatory majoritarian policies from being enacted by Sinhalese majoritarian governments. The pleas of the minority communities were ignored by the British. In 1931, the Tamil politicians in the North boycotted the first elections under the new system of universal suffrage. Commenting on the implications of the Donoughmore reforms, British academic Jonathan Spencer asserted that the distribution of population and the constituency-based system of representation resulted in two political zones, a zone of permanent opposition in the north, where Tamil parties dominated, and a zone of competition in the south, where mostly Sinhala politicians fought for the votes that would get them close to government. The fault lines established in the electoral politics of the 1930s became the disputed borderlands in the Civil War 50 years later. The Donoughmore dispensation created a situation in which divisive and toxic ethno-national concerns became the primary preoccupation of local leaders. Many Sinhalese politicians, for example, were upset that franchise had been extended to the Indian plantation workers almost on the same terms as the indigenous population. Furthermore, Sinhalese politicians feared that the Indians would henceforth undermine Sinhalese interests in plantation districts, where the Indians were by then dominant in terms of demographics. Once Sri Lanka gained its independence in 1948, Sinhalese politicians took action based on these fears and prejudices by enacting the Ceylon Citizenship Act of 1948, which made Indian plantation workers stateless. In sum, this act created two types of citizenship: citizenship by descent and citizenship by registration. In both cases, substantive documentary evidence was required from applicants. The need for documentary evidence to prove citizenship was a social feature of society which Sri Lanka had inherited from the British. However, most Indian Tamil workers were illiterate and very few actually had documentary proof to show they had a long history of residence in Sri Lanka. Over 700,000 Indian Tamils were thus rejected citizenship. It's worth noting, after Ceylon's independence in 1948, it was the Indian plantation Tamils, not the indigenous Sri Lankan Tamils, who were the second largest population in the country after the Sinhalese. So the Ceylon Citizenship Act, triggered by the ethno-nationalism of the Sinhalese as a result of Britain's imposition of the Donoughmore Commission, had dispossessed the second largest population in the country from being citizens. Subsequently, in 1964, as a result of an agreement between India and Sri Lanka, about 525,000 Indian Tamils living in Sri Lanka were repatriated back to India. The second stage in which Britain, during its colonial rule of Ceylon, transferred power was a result of the Solberry Commission in 1944. In the 1940s, Sri Lankan leaders involved in campaigns for self-government began calling for enhanced constitutional provisions. Subsequently, the British concocted the Solberry Commission in 1944. The Solberry Commission report introduced a model of Westminster-style bicameral government. The Westminster-style bicameral government was a European form of government. However, because the British proclaimed to have the world's greatest democracy, the British felt that any alternative form of government, which the Sri Lankan minority community suggests, would only be inferior and therefore shouldn't be worthy of any serious consideration. Given the pluralistic nature of Sri Lanka, the minority protections offered within the Solberry report by the British were far from adequate. The Solberry report contained a clause which later became Section 29.2 in the 1946 Sri Lankan Constitution, prohibiting any legislation infringing on religious freedoms or discrimination against persons of any community or religion. It was also stipulated that a 2/3 majority was required for any changes in the Constitution or any piece of legislation aimed at discriminating against a racial or religious minority. Nevertheless, these minority safeguards were inadequate in that they did not, in any reasonable measure, correspond to the demands put forth by the Ceylon Tamil and Ceylon Indian leadership. Despite pleas from the minority community, the British ruled that minority communities already constituted, I quote, a large and powerful enough bloc to counter any extremist legislation. In 1972, Ceylon became a republic and renamed itself Sri Lanka and implemented a new constitution. The 1972 Constitution, however, marked the most poignant expression of ethnic outbidding that came to being as the primary consequence of British-induced constitution making. It was truly a majoritarian constitution that shamelessly shunned minority rights, most notably the namesake minority safeguard in the Solberry Constitution, namely Section 29.2, was absent in the 1972 Constitution. While I already mentioned the Sinhala Only Act, which was used by the Sinhalese to strengthen their political power and to subjugate the minority community by making Sinhala the sole official language, I should also mention that in 1971, the Sri Lankan government implemented what was known as the Standardization Act, which disproportionately targeted Tamils' admissions to universities by requiring the Tamils score higher in entrance exams than their Sinhalese counterparts. Section 29 of the British engineered Solberry Commission was futile to prevent this discriminatory legislation from being implemented. The entire political saga of the Dominion state of the Republic of Sri Lanka has been marked by this inclination to steer rather than contain ethno-national tensions. The roots of this political culture of spewing division among the masses lie in the constitutional experiments and fatal political miscalculations of the British. The consequences of ramifications of these problematic policies continue to be felt to this very day, and they will shape the political landscape of Sri Lanka for many more decades to come. Hence, the British government must apologize to the government and people of Sri Lanka for the devastating effects caused by its colonization. By doing so, it will be a first step in developing a discourse on reparations and in recognizing the sheer magnitude of colonial atrocities and their present-day ramifications, both of which are some 7 decades overdue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Prasanna. Really interesting overview into how British colonization affected the politics and the political structures that still exist in Sri Lanka to this day. And we'll definitely be exploring that in our Q&A session. I would like to invite our final speaker, Arti Rams, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, just get your bio. Arti Ramsarup. Arti Ramsarup is currently pursuing a postgraduate degree in history at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine campus, Trinidad and Tobago. Her thesis is centered on African Caribbean migration and radical activism, and in Harlem, New York, in the first half of the 12th century. Her research interests include, but is not limited to, African history, African Caribbean history, African American history, British Caribbean migration, radical activism, and activist organizations in the Caribbean and the United States of America, gender history, and concepts of identity. Arti, I'd like to invite you forward to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, James. Good day, everyone. Firstly, thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to be part of this panel and engaging in the discussion on the legacies of the British Empire. As James said, my name is Arti Ramsarup, and I am presently a postgraduate history student at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. My presentation today is entitled Legacies of the British Empire, British Colonization in Trinidad and Tobago, 1797 onwards. The term legacies or colonial legacies implies that influences and outcomes of colonialism are in fact over, yet contemporary economic, political, and social structures across regions continue to be shaped by their distinctive experiences from the period of colonialism. This presentation will focus on social legacies of British colonization on Trinidad. I will begin with a brief historical timeline of the colonization of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad's colonial history began in 1498 when the Spanish landed on the island. At this time, Trinidad possessed a budding indigenous population. However, this did not deter the Spanish invaders. The island became a colony of Spain in 1498, but not until 1592 was a town formally established. Minimal Spanish settlement followed, and Trinidad remained an isolated, barely developed outpost of the vast Spanish-American Empire. In 1783, as part of the cedula, France settled Trinidad. By 1797, when the British entered the island, Trinidad had the markings of a sugar and slavery economy and society, with a mainly French elite and an important free colored class of landowners. In 1802, Britain's possession of the island was confirmed, and Trinidad remained a British colony until its independence in 1962. Tobago was annexed to Trinidad in two stages between 1889 and 1898. Following the British takeover of Trinidad, the plantation system earlier developed by the French expanded, and a plantation economy rooted in the institution of chattel slavery dominated. The quantity of enslaved Africans increased significantly in the early 1800s, with the enslaved population comprising approximately 67% of total population in 1815. In 1838, following emancipation, Trinidad's planters agitated for indentured workers from Asia, following the precedent of the set by Mauritius and British Guyana. In the years 1845 to 1917, approximately 147,000 Indian indentured laborers arrived in Trinidad. Most stayed on the island when their contracts expired, and their descendants constitute a substantial portion of the current population. Apart from Indian indentured laborers, smaller numbers of migrants from other parts of the world also entered Trinidad. As such, by the 20th century, Trinidad had an extremely diverse population in terms of ethnicity, places of origin, religion, and culture. Economically, throughout the 19th century, sugar remained the backbone of the colonial economy, with cocoa expanding rapidly and dominating the export arena by 1900. However, cocoa declined substantially in the 1920s to 1940s and never recovered. Following 1930, oil found in the southern half of Trinidad became the colony's most important source of revenue by the 1930s. The demands of World War II and the development of marine production in the 1950s only increased the domination of oil in the island's modern economy. Trinidad and Tobago developed a rich cultural life from early colonial times, enhanced by the striking diversity of the population. Gordon Lewis posited that the English left its special mark upon its colonial subjects, creating a local culture almost utterly derivative of the most suburban of English values, even although geographically remote from the ancestral sources. He continued that for a whole century, that is to say, from new free labor tropical society established by emancipation, developed along lines set by Victorian Christian bourgeois modes of thought. It was almost completely a unilateral relationship, since as minor colonies, the West Indies local capitals stood little chance of influencing the metropolitan culture or politics. Sadly, this is perpetuated to this day. The Caribbean economist Jitendra Kandon postulated that institutions and the historical conditions that influenced their formations are now widely considered important to understanding differences in economic development across countries. He continued that there are alternative views to the channels through which colonial experience influenced present-day development outcomes. Some economists have argued in favor of a colonizer effect, whereby British colonies benefited from legal systems that were favorable for economic performance compared to other colonial powers. The British had a profound influence on the region's politics, economy, and institutions. The legacy of British colonization persists in Trinidad and Tobago through its political system of governance, language, education system, transportation, and trade linkages, ethnic composition, as well as its dominant economic models. In other words, the legacy of British colonization is presently visible in every facet of Trinidad and Tobago. While some may argue that there have been advantages forged from Trinidad and Tobago's colonial past, the negatives are more prominent. The fact is illuminated through an analysis of the country's present social, economic, and political systems, as well as the modern cry for decolonization and repatriatory justice for the Caribbean region. So going into the social legacies of British colonialism. So societal structure and social hierarchy. The legacy of British colonization of Trinidad is evident in the present-day structure of its society possessed visible remnants of colonial societal structures. Lewis stated that emancipation was accompanied by deep changes in the structure of society. For 1834, without doubt, marked the beginning of a new societal phase in which the old group of planter, merchant, monopolists, and white colonial officials were gradually superseded both in economic power and societal status by the new groups of Creole cultivator, peasant farmer, and native politician. This was accompanied by the rise of the class of free coloreds. Lewis continued that practically every traveler's report on Victorian West Indian life noted the existence of a flourishing colored society, whose members were at once the most fully creolized group of the colonies in their general lifestyle and the most Anglophile in their political and social attitudes. Simply put, colonial Trinidad, like other British colonies, was stratified based on color and education and the attainment of wealth that were main vehicles of social mobility. This system is still ever present in Trinidad and Tobago. The complexion of one's skin and their financial status often determines one's place in society. The divisions in Trinidadian society reflected the economic separatism of its polyglot character. Their divisions were orchestrated by the planter class as a strategy to divide and conquer. Planters often pitted one cultural polity against another. Thus, separatism bled into the politics of Trinidad and Tobago. As the parties are divided, and these are the two main political parties in Trinidad and Tobago, are divided into the two main ethnic communities. And on the night of general elections, many racist comments can be seen on social media from both sides. Moving on to education and language. According to Lewis, in colonial Trinidad and Tobago, the education system followed the class bias of the British metropolitan model, and the contemporary West Indian educational enterprise still inherits the legacy. For example, in 1960, more than 50% of the total working population in Trinidad and Tobago possessed no higher than a primary school education. Moreover, the curriculum itself reeks of Trinidad and Tobago's colonial past, so much so that there has been calls for the decolonization of the curriculum. Decolonization is the process of undoing colonizing practices. Within the educational context, this means confronting and challenging the colonizing practices that have influenced education in the past and which are still present today. Nowadays, colonialism is more subtle and is often perpetuated through curriculum, power relations, and institutional structures. Schools need to consider whose knowledge and ways of knowing are given priority. Decolonized education is rooted in connections to place. Place-based education empowers students to help and helps restore cultural knowledge. Part of the process of decolonizing education is re-establishing links with the community. Education should not occur in a vacuum, and these links are essential for contextualizing knowledge, deepening understanding, encouraging community involvement, and reconnecting students with a vital support system. It is important moving forward to reflect on the goal of education. This reflection often uncovers motives for mandated education deeply rooted in colonialist policy. In terms of language, the official language of the former British colonies is English. At the expense of local dialects, English is often viewed as the yardstick against which all other languages are measured, as well as one's intellectual capabilities. Moving on to place names and monuments. David Trotman articulated that the names inscribed as markers of European possession of Caribbean landscapes stand as irrefutable testimony of its colonial past and are seemingly resistant to the process of symbolic decolonization. European intruders signified their seizure of the New World by various acts or rituals, or what Patricia Seed calls ceremonies of possession, which included naming. As such, Trinidad is lettered with the names of its colonial past. For example, the capital is called Port of Spain. Places carry French names such as La Perouse, Laventille, and Blanchisseuse. Similarly, British names are ever present in Trinidad and Tobago's towns, buildings, and streets. These names were used in the colonial period to remind the inhabitants of their membership to the larger imperial family of their expanding British Empire. Unfortunately, they continue to remind Trinbagonians of this horrid past. McIntyre stated that we cannot change the objective facts of history, but we can re-examine these facts to better guide our perspective. Decolonization is the process of revisiting the objective facts and applying revisited perspectives to improve policies. Sir Hilary Beckles echoed this view as he articulated his position on the Milner case issue at the UWI St. Augustine. He stated, "It is not a question of removing history. You cannot remove history, but you can determine who you will glorify in history." As such, there has been many initiatives to remove colonial statues, monuments, and names from Trinidad and Tobago's landscape. The most recent being the renaming of Milner Hall at UWI to Freedom Hall and the Crossroads Freedom Project initiative to remove Columbus statues from Trinidad. Trotman rightly stated that among the options available to signify post-colonial possession would be an active public history intervention by the use of state funds for the erection of new statues, programs to rename or name public streets, roads, highways, and buildings. Trinidad has somewhat begun this, but more has to be done. Heather Cato stated, "There have been some new statues and memorials erected since the late 20th century. Many of them in Trinidad and Tobago have been cultural icons, like Calypsonians, the Lord Kitchener, Mighty Sparrow, Calypso Rose, chutney artists such as Sundar Popo, and sporting heroes such as Brian Lara and Hasty Crawford. This, however, has not led to the removal of the ones erected during colonization." So while Trinidad and Tobago are highlighting some of their local heroes, the colonial statues are still not being removed. Trinidad and Tobago also made a symbolic change in 1984 when the discretion was made to commemorate Emancipation Day instead of Discovery Day. Furthermore, new narratives with revisionist perspectives have been written by academics, but they still have not really been heard and internalized by the average person. There have also been changes in the curricula at the primary, secondary school, and tertiary levels. However, like I said, much more has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really well-rounded presentation, Artie. So we will now move to our Q&A session, and I'm just going to open up a gallery view. Can we just confirm, can everybody see all of the other speakers? You will see one another? I think so. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and also speakers, feel free if you have any questions for other speakers, then that's great as well. So feel free to do that. But the first question I really want to ask is around reparations. Now, listening to all of the presentations that we've had, there is a real theme coming across, at least in this event, that British colonization has left a negative effect in the countries in question today. And we're talking about a real diversity. We're talking the Caribbean all the way to Africa and even Southern Asia in Sri Lanka. All of you have expressed in different ways the ways in which British colonization has really affected the nations even to this day. And the question I want to ask is around reparations. And I'm going to ask a two-part question, and I'll start with Lenny. First of all, do you feel that Guyana is owed reparations by the British? And if so, what would that look like in practice?
You know, this is tough because, like, I feel like I gotta be realistic about this. I do feel like the British owes Guyana reparations. I mean, it's not just about the indentured laborers or the slaves. It's that and all of the resource exploitation that they profited off of. But it's not going to happen. You know, we will never get reparations for anything. That's just the fact of the matter. Do I think Guyana deserves it? Yes. I think they left the country in shambles. You know, it was in a state of despair, even when my parents were there. And I look at some other countries that didn't have these effects of colonization, how well they're doing today. They're flourishing. And Guyana has gotten so much better today. They're really prospering in their own way. And I think they've overcome a lot of challenges on their own. But I just think about what if they were given back those resources and finances that they lost out for many generations on. Where would we be today? We would be even better off. And I think because we have this history of oppression and suppression, I feel like people don't want to stay in Guyana. And that's why we have what we call the economic brain drain. Whenever people have an education and they can make a difference as a citizen of Guyana, they don't stay. They move to Guyana or London, somewhere in the UK. And I have no family there anymore. You know, they're all here in America. They don't want to stay there. And I think the reason why that's happening, there's a long history of why. And I feel like I can trace it back to the negative impact that the British had on our people and our economy. So do I think they owe us reparations? Yes. Do I think we'll ever get it? No.
And your response in terms of reparations there was very sort of economic focused. Do you think that there are other types of reparations that could be more realistic? If you just want to unmute yourself.
I don't know if I would say choose the word realistic, because I just know it won't happen. But it's the economic part, but obviously it's also the laboring. It's the slaves and the indentureship. The money that they were missed out on, the land that they were deprived of the resources that were stripped from their hands. It's really tough to think about because you know, these people really worked hard for what they have today, and to know that they weren't paid back in full from their grandparents, their great grandparents, and so forth, it's hard to think about. But yeah, I think it's not just about the economic part, it's also about, you know, the human laboring, you know, the forced labor also.
Thank you very much. Rothney, I'll pose the same question to you. Do you think South Africa is owed reparations by the British? And if so, what would that look like in practice?
Well, of course, James, the easy response is, of course, yes. If you look at the Queen and the diamonds that still adorn her, and then, now you would have heard, I was born outside of Kimberley, and Kimberley is basically where the diamonds, after they were discovered in Hope Throne, is the second spot where De Beers, you know, made sure that it took basically all the diamonds out of. If you look at that place today, you would never think that it is a place where diamonds were first discovered. So, of course, the response is yes, and of course, reparations would be and should be in many forms. But I am, of course, just like my brother who just spoke now, I don't think that is going to happen, because you see the way that colonialism works is now such a very sophisticated way, in that, for instance, not even a tax on wealthy people in this country is ever going to happen. I mean, we have some of these conversations that Desmond Tutu had proposed at one point, as little as that. And you find that most of the leadership of this country is, in one way or another, once again, in bed with companies that have always made sure that they deprive this continent. I mean, the ANC government, we know for a long time, has been captured by London and by Stellenbosch. The whole Rhodes Must Fall thing reminded us of the fact that the British has never left this continent, and that they continue to make sure that they amass wealth, and they do that in very sophisticated ways by even making the formerly oppressed people their spokespeople. And that makes it even much more difficult to say, how do we go about making this a practical thing? So I don't think we're having this conversation with the proper people, and this is usually the problem, is that we know what must happen because we speak from that point of, but we're speaking to ourselves and not with the people who are supposed to account to some of these things that are still a problem for us in societies.
And a counter question: whenever I hear, different points of view around reparations, you're always faced with the question, well, colonization happened a long time ago, you're independent now, why not just get over it and move on? What would you say to someone who would make that comment?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because that is now even what is referred to apartheid, for instance. And people argue that if you speak about the fact that land was taken from Black people, and that their animals were taken through tax that was imposed on them, knowing very well that they're not able to pay these taxes, how long are we supposed to go? You see, and this is not a question that is asked by white folk, but it is asked by Black people today, who don't think, and these are the ones, of course, that are wealthy in society. So I'm asked this question not by white people, but by Black people who are part of the problem, who are part of the ones that have managed to benefit when of course the Black economic empowerment thing happened in this country, that individual Black people were then amassed quite a number of wealth, but not communities were empowered. I mean, that's why South Africa is the most unequal society today in the world.
Thank you very much, Rothney. I would like to pose the same question to Marcia and to Andrew. And really interestingly, we'll get on to Barbados becoming a republic soon. But do you think Britain owes Barbados reparations? I know there are calls from CARICOM and the Barbadian government I've seen many of the speeches done by Sir Hilary Beckles. Do you think it's practical? Do you think it will ever happen? And if you do think it should happen, what would it look like in Barbados?
Everything in the positive. For me, I was taken once on a tour of Liverpool by a lovely gentleman who, his purpose of, he was of Barbadian descent, possibly fourth generation. His father would have gone on one of the ships in the late 19th century, seamen, West Indian seamen up and down, included into Africa. And he had made it his business to look at the buildings. So visually, he said, oh, look how that thing is shaped. That's a symbol of the Liverpool Slave Trading Company. Once you learn the images and you walk around Liverpool, one of the ports of slave trading spaces right throughout the triangle, you see all the wealth. And then you look up, as a friend of mine says, when you're in London, just look up and you see these magnificent buildings built on the back. Or I've been to Spain, look up, go to the museums, amazing pieces with diamonds and jewels from South America. It's all around you. I agree with Rodney. The argument is yes, no. It's interesting because we in the Caribbean have made a call for reparations. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles wrote a book called Black Debt. And if there's one country in the Caribbean who have the bill, it's Haiti. When Haiti declared independence in 1804, France said, right, okay, please pay this compensation for leaving, taking yourself out of the French Empire. And it took Haiti until the beginning of the 20th century to pay it. It's interesting that when the president reminded the UN, etc., of that, hey, he was deposed. So Haiti has the receipts. We have receipts in our minds and we can construct them. At the moment, we are arguing for not necessarily money in your hands, which is when the argument becomes very minimal. What are you going to do with all this money? How is it going to be divided? I know that they're thinking of instances, for example, on this side of the continent in the West Indies, we grew sugar. So enslaved Africans taken from the continent, sugar wasn't there, sugar is here. And we have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world because enslaved peoples were paid, big quotation marks, in sugar. They weren't paid. The planter would give a few sugar and give them some rum, etc. And eventually our DNA, our biological makeup was affected. So I do know there's an argument for research, more research on diabetes. Hundreds and thousands of people throughout the region suffer from diabetes, etc. I'll pass on to Andrew to hear his point, his response.
Marcia's response is perfect. I think one of the things that we haven't come to grips with, certainly in Barbados as a society, is the idea of the cultural trauma that emerged out of the slavery and the plantation system. And the fact that, most of the profits that emerged out of that system ended up, as Eric Williams so correctly argued, in fostering an industrial revolution in Europe. So therefore, it is not difficult to do the math. It is clear. But then again, the issue is these crimes against humanity. When these countries that then moved out of the region, the debt seemed to have been reversed. I mean, we seem to have suffered because there was no compensation. In fact, it was the planters, it was the folks who left that were compensated. So that inequity in how we view that relationship, and it is a poor relationship, because if you look back to the very two important UN conferences on racism, the ability of some of these countries to impose this divide and rule, where they're able to play favorites against each other, meant that there's no unity. That could be one reason why it is difficult to be hopeful. But I think again, the only way, if I'm using my imaginary sense right, the only way that it happens really is that Europe comes to a different conception of human again, and sees its relationship and its responsibility to righting wrongs, and to recreating relationships to the mutual benefit of both rich and poor.
Thank you. Prasana, you were very vocal in your, towards the end of your presentation, that Britain at least owes an apology. Do you think Britain owes an apology and more, or do you think they just owe an apology?
They certainly owe more than an apology, but you know, an apology, you know, is a good start on a moral level. They certainly owe reparations. You know, as I had mentioned during my talk, you know, Britain's policies in Ceylon when it was colonized, those policies, once Ceylon became independent, once Sri Lanka became independent, they led to the 30-year ethnic conflict. So there was enormous bloodshed, and the Tamil-dominated north and east of the country was just devastated by war. And still today, they're devastated. The 30-year war ended in 2009, so it's not that long ago. And you know, what Britain can do is you know, provide money to build homes, you know, among the lower economic class who were severely affected by the war. That's just one of the many things that Britain can do. And I'm glad that Marcia brought up the point regarding the real example of Haiti, you know, because that's a real example where Haiti's leader, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, you know, he's the first democratically elected leader of Haiti. He, you know, told France, you know, that we deserve reparations, you know, because you know, France demanded that Haiti pay over 21 billion US dollars. Sorry, Aristide demanded that France pay Haiti over 21 billion US dollars, which is equivalent to like 90 million francs. And, you know, Haiti was forced to pay for its freedom. Haiti was forced, you know, the France said, you know, you're independent, but we want you to pay for the slaves, for our Haitian slaves. So Haiti, as Marcia had mentioned, you know, for several decades had to pay France for its freedom. And, you know, as Marcia mentioned, once Aristide made that demand, you know, France, Canada, the United States in 2004 had overthrown Aristide. So that provides, you know, an example of what can happen if a country like, you know, Sri Lanka were to say, all right, you know, we have these receipts, you know, this is the bloodshed that your policies have caused. You know, we want you to pay this amount of reparations. Sri Lanka is also in debt, and the economy is in shambles right now. That's not solely due to Britain, but it's played a role. And certainly, if Sri Lanka said, you know, these are our receipts, you have to pay us this amount, Britain's not going to look too kindly on that. Colonial powers don't look too kindly when they're shown the receipts, when they're shown the evidence of the atrocities which they caused.
Thank you very much. Artie, same question to yourself. Is Trinidad and Tobago owed reparations by Britain? And if so, what would that look like in practice?
Okay, I definitely agree with the persons before. Trinidad and Tobago, as the Caribbean, all former British colonies, definitely deserve reparations. I think if anything comes out of this conversation here today, is the lasting effect that colonization had on these colonies and the lasting negative effect. And I think that that has to, you know, show for something when we are talking about reparations. And I think a lot of people think reparations and they think money. You think we should be repaid, or we should be paid a certain amount of money. And with that conception, it can seem unattainable. But reparations can come in many ways. We can have educational development, start changing the narrative of these former colonies, and you know, we can also have investments in healthcare, have investments in infrastructure, all of these things. And I think what is important is investments or money from Britain towards the development of these things without expecting something in return. And I think reparations can look like that as well. So.
Thank you. And would you say that the current Trinidadian economy has been impaired by British colonization, or do you think that post-independence Trinidad has been able to grow its own economy free from British influence?
You can definitely see the influence of British colonization. Trinidad is still very much an export-import sort of economy, where we do not really produce anything down here. You know, in Trinidad, a lot of these things are imported, and we don't really manufacture. And that is definitely coming out of colonialism. And also we operate very much like a plantation society. When you look at what is produced, what is exported, what is imported. And so there would have definitely been developments throughout the years, but you can still see the effects of colonization and colonialism.
Thank you. And Lenny, the same question to you. Do you feel like Ghana's economy still to this day has been affected by British rule, or do you think that since independence, Ghana has been able to make economic progress free from British influence?
I think they definitely have made economic progress since the British influence, and since they've declared independence from the British back in 1966. You can see the progress from a helicopter view just over time. But that progress was definitely slowed by the British Empire. I think if it wasn't for what they did, and you know, if they paid us back in some sort of reparations, back to at least the government, I think those economic progressions would have been much faster and earlier and on a higher level. And also, I just wanted to say to Pitasana that I really agree with the bare minimum of an apology, public apology. So I hope that answers your question, James.
Thank you. And the same question goes to Rothney. How's South Africa's economy doing? Is it still impaired by British rule and some of the comments you made earlier, or has there been a level of independent progress?
So you would have seen, I try not to really separate the British from the Dutch because I have seen how easy it can be for them to rally around and to forget their differences, but to understand what white supremacy, how it works. And you would know South Africa is one country where white supremacy is quite glaring. I mean, in the USA and in the UK, for instance. But ours is an economy that comes from both the apartheid era and way before then. That's why we are mostly indebted to the World Bank and all of these international, lending companies. I mean, when this country had the first democratic election in 1994, it also inherited all of the debt that most of the whites, when this was coming, decided to take lots of this money outside of the country. So that is just went like that. We did not start, and we're given money, but we started on loans and also on debts that we had inherited from the past. And of course, when you have like international currencies, that determines basically what and how you can sell what you have based on how these things fluctuate depending on how the West feel at one particular time. So these are all things that make it very difficult really to say you will have an independent economy that is not dependent on the West. I mean, when Gaddafi, spoke of the unity of Africa, it was precisely to begin to say, let us put our resources together instead of always continually be dependent on the West in that way. Just one point. That the Lancaster House Agreement of 1978, what in a way had said, they would assist Robert Mugabe to make sure that the land is sort of distributed in a fair basis. That never happened, even though they have agreed. So these are people that you cannot covenant with. You cannot trust their words because they have shown themselves so many times that they are not trustworthy, and that's why we have discounted conversations of reparations and began to look internally. What is it that the African can get right so that we can be weaned of this dependence of the West?
Thank you very much. Really good response, Marcia and Andrew. In the new Republic of Barbados, I'll pose this question in a kind of modern framework. How has Barbados been able to economically progress since independence? And additionally, do you think that becoming a republic will loosen those influences of British colonization further and allow Barbados to economically prosper even further?
James, we became a republic last week. Jokes aside, we really only became a republic 2 months ago, a month ago. And so I don't think I can answer the broader part of the impact on the economics of being a republic because we're right now wrestling with what does it mean to be a republic. We were independent since 1966, and I honestly believe we were still in the process of trying to understand the meanings of independence. And now we're a republic. So I can't speak to the economy. There are a lot of crisis calls, etc., but I don't have the stats, and we've just begun. Andrew, do you have a comment?
Yeah, the more things change, the more they remain the same. The global arrangement of the economic order itself still is going to be a problem. I think what is interesting is that we matured philosophically. That is how we start to look at ourselves, how we start to look at how we produce. We recognize, for example, we have no manufacturing base. We recognize there's no more sugar. What replaces it? We're looking at a global world now. We're talking about IT. We're talking about crypto. But remember, before crypto, we talked about technology, and we talked about innovation, and the language goes around and round and round. But still there's no investment. There was offshore banking, for which for a number of years, Barbados really became prosperous. But what happens? If you exist as number 9, I think, top earner in the world from offshore banking, then they changed the rules. And that means that whereas before, you had the ability to construct your economy for that kind of investment, that's now no longer legitimate. It's called money laundering. What I think is important to see in all this is, yes, republic, but republic comes from a certain place of struggle historically, which is what we've been talking about. So we can talk about sovereignty, we can talk about we recognize the issues, and we can hopefully begin to see different ways. People talk about China is a dangerous option. We talk about other types of financing and what have you. But I think understanding the South, and I think this is what the current leader in Barbados and what we really is conceiving. And that is, we're going to show the world a different face, and through that kind of engagement, we're going to leverage power in a a completely different way. Whether it's successful or not is another discussion. The last thing I want to say is that the Republic has been on the minds of Barbadians now for at least 20 years. All right. And we've had a succession, a number of leaders who have said, yes, we're going to do it. And it never happened. And the question is why? What was the fear of being a republic that a leader now just says, enough. This is it. This is the way forward. This is decisive. And this is what we are going to show the world who we are and the capability of building new societies. That, I think, goes hand in hand with the call for reparations. It says we are respectable. It says we are not going to kowtow to anybody's political ideology, and we're going to set a path for ourselves. Whether it is successful or not, that's another discussion.
Thank you very much, both. Personally, you sort of touched on it in your last answer, but how has British colonization impacted the Sri Lankan economy? And now, well, since independence and since becoming a republic, has Sri Lanka's economy been able to show any signs of progress?
In terms of the impact on Sri Lanka's economy, during Britain's colonial rule, when the Indian plantation workers they had discussed forming unions, trade unions, in order to try to improve their standard of living, in order to try to gain a sense of money for themselves for the exploitation that they were being subjected to. Britain kind of perceived this as a kind of Marxist infiltration of the country. So the British kind of responded by jailing certain Marxist leaders and certain left-wing trade activists, and that kind of policy of economic exploitation, the Sri Lankan government has just kind of adopted that policy against the Indian Tamils, just completely exploiting them while they work for bare minimum wages. And so that policy of exploitation of anti-unions, the Sri Lankan government has carried that on, and the tea plantations are an extremely lucrative sector of the Sri Lankan economy. And Sri Lanka's economy is now in shambles, and I read like just the other day that in order to pay Iran, Sri Lanka owes Iran a serious amount of debt. In order to pay that debt, Sri Lanka decided to exchange about $200 million of tea plantation commodities as a form of bartering. So that's just one instance. But in terms of the economics of Tamils was severely hindered by their expulsion from government services by the Sri Lankan government in retaliation for the preferential treatment which Tamils were given by the British. This seriously economically disadvantaged Tamil people, there was discriminatory standards once again imposed on them for university admission. So they were denied admission. They were required to have higher entrance exam scores. So their ostracization from academia, from government, from the military, from being a part of the Sri Lankan state, that forced many Tamils to leave Sri Lanka, and they decided to be in the Western countries, and many of their children are in very good positions. The second generation are in very good positions and in higher up positions in Western societies, but many of them are just lower class people, lower class economic citizens.
Thank you. And Artie, the same question to you. In fact, you mentioned that I know you sort of mentioned it in your last comment, but in terms of Trinidad and Tobago's economy, what do you think the future will be more prosperous? A lot of people would feel that since the British left Trinidad and Tobago in the 60s, What would you say to people who feel that it's time for you to move on and that your economy, there's no excuse as to why Trinidad can't prosper, for example?
Okay, what would I say? Okay, firstly, while we can see the effects of colonialism and our colonial past on our present economy, there has been developments. We are not still producing sugar. That has been long gone, right? Trinidad has moved on to oil, and then with the entire situation and drop in oil prices and stuff like that, that's not so much the focus of our economy anymore. However, as with moving on, I think it's very, how do I put it? It's like telling someone move on from history or move on from the past. So it sometimes it's very difficult to simply overlook something and what it has done to a system, or like the underlying effects. And when I say that Trinidad operates somewhat like a plantation society, in that we still have ingrained in us to import what is needed. We don't make what we need in Trinidad. We still produce things to export. And I am not sure how much that can change in the near future, because I feel like just like when, during colonialism or that colonial period where the country was not big, for lack of a better word here, big enough to make certain decisions and to stand up on the global scale by themselves. I feel like we are still in that setting where Trinidad is, if we are not in a position to make demands and I think we need to find a way to reach to that position where we can speak and set prices and operate like the more developed countries and sort of come out of this developing status. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So just a few more topics to get through, but we do have some questions from the audience. So these will be open questions. So any one of our speakers, if you want to come forward and answer them, that's totally cool. So one question says, is it accurate to view the USA as a former English colony rather than a transformation to mere neo-colonialism by the colonizers and their descendants? Does anybody want to make a response to that question? I know the USA wasn't one of the countries that we had intended to discuss in this event, but it's a good question. And anybody wanted to cover that one?
Can you repeat that question one more time, James? I'm sorry.
Sure. So the question was, is it accurate to view the USA as a former English colony rather than a transformation to mere neo-colonialism by the colonizers and their descendants? So I think the question is asking, how do we kind of view the USA in terms of their colonial experience? We can leave the question and we can answer it later on in the comments, or.
I think that the United States is a former English colony, and especially with respect to slavery, that was something that the United States had adopted from the English. And the institution of slavery, it's responsible for the economic foundations of the United States as it presently stands. And certainly there have been many cases that have been made for reparations, and they're very legitimate cases. There are many ways that reparations can come about for descendants of slaves. Not, people think reparations is like a check that's written. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be investment in Black communities, across the United States that are facing severe hardship. Certainly the U.S. government has a responsibility to do that. Certainly Britain does as well, but let's start with the United States government. But it certainly is a former colony, and Yeah, I think it could be both. I don't think it's an either or. And certainly it's the descendants of slaveholders do carry out these neo-colonial policies by refusing to acknowledge the hardships that descendants of slaves and slaves went through to economically build the United States, the foundations for what it is today.
Thank you. Marcia, you got your hand up?
Yes, I do. I would be remiss. I have friends in what they now call the Islands, AY, indigenous name for what is now called the US Virgin Islands. And one of the things I think I would like us to reflect on as we go ahead is resistance, because there's always resistance. So thank you for the person with the question of the American colonization. One sec. At the moment, the United States is an empire within the Caribbean. I have learned from my friends to say Virgin Islands, US. The Virgin Island, if you say Virgin Island, then you forward the actual space, and then you speak of the colonizer. Puerto Rico, excuse me. So let's take the Bahamas. The point is, we actively are struggling with American imperialism now. That's it. I come back. I'm a little tired. Andrew, if you want one through.
Andrew, did you want to come back on that one?
No, I think the U.S. really coming out of that colonial arrangement certainly had the means and had this huge landmass to exploit and make their way in the world. So she's right. It has become an imperialist center of itself. It is a global leader, and it continues to ensure that this global arrangement of North-South remains and is conducted that way. And it worked its way into that position. So there's no comparison really.
And if I could also just expand on Marcia's point about the United States as being a global superpower. The United States still, as the global superpower, carries out a form of colonialism by controlling the global financial system and denying countries who seek to nationalize their industries and who seek to implement policies where their state resources, the income generated from that, can go towards the poor and the working class. So countries like Venezuela, countries like Cuba, countries like Haiti that tried to do that, the United States lashes out and says, no, you cannot do that. We're expelling you from the global financial system. The profits have to go to foreign US corporations. And if you do not submit to this, we're going to deny you from the financial system. We're going to, as Henry Kissinger said in the case of Chile, we're going to make your economy scream. When Salvador Allende nationalized many state resources and tried to implement policies for the poor of Chile. So the United States still carries out this colonial project as the global superpower, but it does it through the financial institutions. You no longer really have those slaves. It's all masked under international relations and the global financial system.
Interesting. I mean, to our audience, because we're getting a lot of questions about the USA, this is part of a series that is ongoing, and we do plan to cover as many of the different former British colonies as we can. I'm sure you guys are aware, watching, how big the British Empire was. It's impossible to talk about all of these countries and regions in one event. We did have 5 countries that we wanted to focus on in this event, but we will be discussing the USA and future former British colonies at future events. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to take one more question from the audience, and then we'll start to wrap it up, because we have been on for about 2 hours now. Time flies. So one more question from the audience. do you believe that more countries will follow Barbados in becoming a republic? I know that some of the countries have already done that, but just an open question. What do you guys think? That can be taken by any of our speakers.
I have my water. Sorry, audience. There seems to be quite a lot of discussion globally because perhaps this is a moment. We think of Canada and Australia in the Caribbean. Jamaica has begun our talking of discussions, perhaps St. Lucia, but in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago crossed that floor in the 1970s, and Dominica as well. So yes, it seems to be a question of really what are the benefits and the sense of identity. I think that was a topic we were to get to, because for the colonized people or the formerly colonized peoples, we are in the process of unraveling the many identities that we've had over 300-400 years. And for that, then I support the Republic in the sense of it allows us to continue our own self-searching and self-finding. And I think that's happening around the world. It'll be interesting what happens though, because maybe there's a moment that we see cracks in the mighty British Empire or in the Commonwealth. There are cracks there now, perhaps with what's happening in England with the Queen, etc. And the opportunity seems to be there. Yeah. I welcome conversations from my colleagues.
Interesting. Any more comments on that question? Okay, right. So, guys, there were so many things we could have talked about today. I did want to ask you questions about the education systems and how empire is taught in the different nations that we were discussing today. But that can be something that we discuss on a future event. Or as individuals, or we could put out some social media content on that as well. Also, identity is always an interesting one about how British colonization has impacted identity. In the Caribbean, for example, many people have mixed ancestries as a result of British colonization, and even the concept of blackness and whiteness are these colonial constructs as well that didn't necessarily exist beforehand. These are many discussions that we can think about now and have discussions about in the future. So what I'm going to ask is a 1-minute summary from each speaker before we wrap up our event. So Lenny, are you able to give a 1-minute summary, please, about how British colonization has impacted Guyana?
Yeah, so just to wrap it up, I think it's impacted Guyana in multiple ways. I think it's definitely hardened the people into working to get their country to what they envisioned it to be. I think it was a major roadblock in terms of economic progression. I think they still have some societal issues that they have to work out that were kind of pitted against each other through British Empire. And you know, the narratives that you see when it comes to like these racial inequalities, it can be traced back to what the British were telling the people when they first arrived. So I think there is some work to be done still. I think the British do need to address a lot of what has happened, because you still see a lot of relics from the past in the modern day society there.
Okay, thank you very much. Rothney, could you provide a 1-minute summary? How has British colonization affected South Africa?
Well, James, I think it is affected us very negatively, to such an extent that I think even for Black people, and I've spoken earlier about what I call a flight from the Black self. You know, when you want to create the impression that everything African is backward and barbaric, you know, savage and stuff like that, and you create forms of life that become the forms of life, that Eurocentricity becomes what everyone wants to gravitate towards. So that is the problems that we are dealing with. And so the question for me has always been, what do we do with the fact that we have not always been colonized? Because you see, the problem is, because of the fact that this is so in our face all the time, we seem to be reducing ourselves only to that, but we have not always been colonized. There's a great other perspectives that speak to a history of civilization that we have not, because of our obsession to want to prove to the West that in fact we're human beings, that we have not tapped into. And so I think we also need to sort of mobilize resources towards that, so that people get a sense that we have not, in as much as it is a bad thing, we have not always been colonized. We have a glorious history that I think it is only in our interest to begin to pursue that as well, and to have a better understanding of who we are as a people.
Thank you very much, Rosny. Marcia and Andrew, I suppose maybe you have to do like 30 seconds each.
30
Marcia,
seconds. 30 seconds. I actually wrote this down. My friend from South Africa said more or less the same thing. I wanted to quote Edouard Glissant from Martinique. He says, history is a fictional fantasy of the West. And he attacks Hegel and his march of history, which conveniently leaves out the entire continent of Africa, sort of kind of recognizes the indigenous peoples in South America, but says, of course, Europe leads the march of history. I would encourage all of my colleagues and all online to question the timelines given. As my friend in South Africa said, I could start from 1625, but I choose to start as early as possible, 60,000 years. Reinvest voices or give voice to those who have been marginalized by imperial timelines as you reconstruct your identities. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, all I would say is that we also have to be very careful, because we can be very romanticist about the past. You know, the real is acknowledging what has happened to our communities or societies because of this. In acknowledging the history, we have to acknowledge that we are also, because of that experience, creating, in a sense, a new way of being, an alternative way of being. It's something that has been disrupted. There's a rupture. And we have to work through, and are working through, whether or not we recognize it or not, that what I call that cultural trauma. And it links all the way to this idea of waking up one day perhaps and saying, okay, we're going to be a republic, because the mindset then is changing, and the way we see the world is more critical, and perhaps gives us a better option for moving forward.
Thank you very much. Prasana, 60 seconds. What legacies has British colonization left in Sri Lanka?
So, the Britain's colonization of language in Sri Lanka, giving preferential treatment to Tamils who were predominantly learning English in the north, and the imposition of British engineered constitutional solutions through the Donoughmore Commission and the Solberry Commission. These were not in line with the interests of the minority communities at the time, and they had expressed this. And so the British engineered systems were then in post-independent Sri Lanka. They were used by the majority Sinhalese community to retaliate against the minority Tamils who were privileged by the British during colonization, and to impose discriminatory policies which economically disenfranchised the minority Tamil community, and it led them to leave Sri Lanka as a result of ethnic pogroms and the Civil War. And there's a good quote by the Sri Lankan Prime Minister SWRD Bandaranaike, who had deployed ethno-national politics to make his way to the premiership in 1956. And he said, I quote, "There was no fight for that freedom which involved a fight for principles, policies, and programs which could not be carried out unless that freedom was obtained. No, it just came overnight. We woke up one day and we were told, you're a dominion now." Britain had just, made Sri Lanka, independent as Dominion without taking knowledge of the views of the stakeholders of the Tamils, of the Indian plantation Tamils, of the Muslims, of the Sinhalese. They had just imposed their way, and as a result, we're still reeling from that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Arti, the final word goes to you.
Yeah, the legacy of British colonization is definitely still visible in every facet of Trinidad and Tobago. It persists through the political system of governance, language, education system, transportation, like I said in my presentation, trade linkages, ethnic composition, and the dominant economic models. I think what is important is that while everyone here today sort of spoke to the negative side, there are people who argue that there has been positives of British colonization. But I think it is clear that the evidence show that the negative outweigh the positive, and through this we can definitely see that there has to be decolonization. And there is an argument for reparations and reparatory justice in the Caribbean region, as well as other British colonies.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of our speakers today. I've really enjoyed hearing your presentations and hearing your differing perspectives. Thank you to our audience for joining in. And as mentioned, this was the first in a series of discussions that we'll be having that will invite different individuals speaking about different former British colonies, about their experience, both historical and contemporary. If our audience has any questions for any of our speakers, you can contact us on social media, leave any comments, send an email, and we can definitely explore any questions that you have in more detail. Thank you very much again to all of our speakers, and bye for now. Thank you.